Sorry to rush you, but as my students through the years know, I run a tight schedule in my classes. It's like everything just like that. All right, yes. Beautiful. Beautiful. Praise God. Oh, man, what a powerful opening session. And it was so nicely, this next session was so nicely set up by the last question we got, because we're going to address exactly the issue that you were raising in this session. I'll in a minute invite President Pittman back up to introduce our next set of speakers and to moderate your questions. And as we begin, we're going to show up here, there's no narration to it, so there's no voiceover, but it's a timeline of disciples and indigenous peoples that we have put together. I want to say that all of this stuff, all of the timelines that we're going to be putting, all of the speeches and presentations, we're going to put together in a book form that will be published by Chalice Press. Hopefully, I'll have it to them within a couple of months. I'll edit it, and it should be out by the end of the year. So I encourage you to look for that. I also want to say that on the discipleshistory.org website, so if you just Google, Disciples Historical Society, you'll see our website. There is a link called Disciples History Podcasts. I have been conducting podcast interviews. I am not only a scholar and an author and an editor and a publisher, I am now a media personality, internet media sensation. Rick Lowry. But there are a series of podcasts. I've recorded 10 so far. I think we've got 6 that are processing up, but through the course of this week, the other 4 that I've done so far, and I'm going to continue to do these podcasts with some of the speakers in this conference. The inaugural podcast was with our general minister and president, and I've had a number of podcasts with the people, the personalities, the scholars you will see. And so a lot of this information is going to just be a permanent part of the record. You can go at any point, and they're about 45 minutes. 42 to 45 minutes. You could use them for an adult study group in your congregation. So I just really want to encourage you to do that. And I want to thank our archivist, Shelley Jacobs, who ran up here to talk about the Stone's Cherokee sermon. Shelley is the one who has worked with various scholars who are participating in this conference to put together the timelines. We'll have timelines of Native American, Asian American, Hispanic, and African American experience in the disciples and broader Stone Campbell tradition. So Shelley Jacobs, our archivist, has really been key in putting that together. Again, any editorial mistakes, look at me for that. But these will be wonderful resources, and we will put them on the website. I think I have now said everything that I told myself I was going to say, and what I will do is now, if we could cue up the timeline, the appropriate timeline, and let's get that going.
So in 2001, when Don and I returned from Taiwan in our time with our global ministries, we brought our daughter, who was 12, back with us, of course. She was reluctant to come, but we did bring her back. And we threw her into a large, prominent public school system here in Tulsa that just runs on the southeast side of Tulsa. And that particular high school at that time won every football game and every basketball game and every baseball game in the state of Oklahoma. And my daughter, Marilyn, was an enthusiastic proponent of this particular school. But it had a mascot that was yes. And no matter how much we tried to help her understand how egregious it is to take an indigenous person and make them a caricature in cartoon and in character and in substance, she continued to shout and insist that, oh no, this means nothing. If we use that word, it's flattering. Steve Cranford, for those of you who even knew the redoubtable and wonderful Steve Cranford, tried to tell her otherwise. Oh no. Besides, she said, she knew lots of Native Americans who liked that word. Two years ago, Union High School finally, but without confession, decided it was time to change its mascot. And part of that was based on letters written from the alumni from all over the country. And I'm proud to say that Marilyn Pittman Flowers was one of those people who said, stop that. White people in Oklahoma have been taking over Native American image, Native American theologies, Native American things, using them and discarding them. Even the disciples who sent missionaries when Indian territory opened up so they could grab church lands without any attention to who was already there. So we turn our attention now to the history of disciples and in relationships with indigenous persons. And the people that are going to lead us in this conversation include the very passionate Lisa Barnett, Dr. Lisa Barnett, Assistant Professor of American Religious History here at Phillips Theological Seminary. She earned her BA here in Oklahoma because she's from Oklahoma. She earned her BA at the University of Central Oklahoma. For some reason, she went down south, across the Red River, earned an MDiv at Bright Divinity School. Who would do that? And then earned her PhD at Texas Christian University. Go Frogs. We were excited to hire Dr. Barnett because she brings passion as well as excellence in her research and her teaching. And she's passionate about two things. Well, the two things I'm going to say publicly. She's passionate about disciples' histories. And she leads our students in amazing explorations of what it means to have been a disciple and to be one now. And she's passionate about the indigenous people's histories in the United States. I also have the privilege of introducing to you Father Joshua Miller Shawnee, who is the pastor of the Parish Church of St. Jerome here in Tulsa. Now, I call Joshua brilliant and agile, for Josh is a person who is so incredibly curious that he plunges himself into library science, for example, and now indigenous histories. and masters these disciplines and then helps us also understand them. He is currently a student in our Master of Theology Studies here at Phillips. And he recently won the scholarship, the Native Student Scholarships from the Western History Association, and was able to present a paper there and then at the conference, the Church History Conference. Yes, we're very proud of Josh. Now, I'm going to say all of those wonderful things about him. He also works for the Shawnee Nation and is now currently involved in research that has to do with Native children and burial. Just think about that. But here's one more fact. When the federal judge in October 2013 declared that gay marriage was in fact a legal reality, I'm pretty sure that Josh and his beloved Kyle were the first two men to marry in the state of Oklahoma, thanks to Reverend Jeff Brewster right here. Yes. Dave Bell. Now here's what I'm going to, adjective I'm assigning to you. I want to say persistent, but I would say relentlessly persistent, because Dave Bell would not let go for decades of the reminder that there are some people who are not at our table. And he has persisted and persisted in calling us to attend to the fact that we've welcomed a lot of folks, but Indigenous persons have not had a place until Dave led all the denomination into recognizing that fact. He is now the Minister of Indigenous Justice with the Center for Indigenous Ministries, but he lives on the Yakima Reservation and farms and runs cattle. Graduated from Humboldt University and earned his MDiv at Pacific School of Religion, which none of his disciples are really trying to hold against you, but really Sharice, Newell, and I are here. So grateful for these three scholars and for their willingness to lead us in uncovering what we never knew before. Thank you. Dr. Barnett. Oh, sorry. Reverend Shawnee Miller.
Well, good morning. I'd like to start today by thanking the leadership of the Disciples History Society for the remarkable opportunity to speak with you today about something that's important to me and should be important to us all. And that's the complexities of Native identity and belonging within a North American Christian context. Now, as with any minority group, particularly communities that have historically been oppressed or marginalized, we must begin with a seemingly simple question. What do we call them? What word or phrase do we use to identify this community of persons? This is not a simple or an easy task, though especially in regard to Native communities and Indigenous kinship circles. How do we reduce the vast array of Indigenous social structures and languages and cultures and lifeways and family systems in Native North America to a single word or a single phrase? Even if we could, who gets to pick the word? The earliest explorers who discovered them, the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the largest and wealthiest of the tribes? In truth, anytime we name a community, we essentialize that community. We can't help but intellectually homogenize them. By attempting to name Indigenous peoples, we fall into that historical fallacy trap of categorizing and classifying events and peoples into or out of existence, of finding likeness and connection where there may be none, and of imposing the facade of order as a means of minimizing differences, complexity, diversity, agency, and ultimately sovereignty, all for simplicity's sake. This helps us to understand why there are so many names for the indigenous peoples of North America. American Indian, Native Americans, First Nations, First Peoples, and yet none of them seem to fit, and that should tell us something. For even among tribal communities, there is no agreement. Some communities reject the word Indian as colonizing, while other tribes and communities embrace it proudly. Many activists favor the phrase First Nations, feeling that it honors the vast social structures and economies and communities that existed prior to colonization, while tribal elders within that same community may fear that it reshapes the tribal socio-political structures and into an increasingly corrupting Western mindset. Even the phrase Native Americans is problematic for many reasons and for many peoples. Not the least of these is the indigenous peoples of the northern and southern borderlands. Those communities that existed well before the naming of continents and the imposition of artificial and temporary boundaries. Needless to say, it's very complicated. So whenever possible, we should allow communities and peoples to name themselves. In my tribe, the Shawnee tribe, we freely and proudly use the word Indian and tribe and Native American interchangeably, as I will do today. But when I do, I am speaking not only from my particular tribal background, but from my particular clan and my own granular experience within my family kinship circle. I do not speak today on behalf of the Shawnee tribe, let alone of all Native Americans. For instance, I cannot speak authoritatively on the Indian experience of Christianization, because even among Shawnee peoples, the loyal Shawnee and the absentee Shawnee experienced missionary activity and its effects in very, very different ways. I cannot teach you about the Native American theology or cosmology because the singular Native understanding or experience of anything simply doesn't exist. The worldviews and lifeways of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest are demonstrably divergent from the great Southwestern tribes, who cosmologically and ceremonially diverge from the tribes originating around the Great Lakes. And yet we try to subsume and sublimate diverse arrays of peoples into a single homogenized racial or ethnic box that can be checked on a government form. So what's in a name? Quite a lot, it seems. And our inability to settle on a name for the native peoples of North America should teach us that native identity in North America is as multifaceted as it is complicated. So today I'd like to touch very briefly on a few points of reference that can be helpful for the North American church, namely tribal recognition and enrollment, blood quantum, cultural perceptions of who's a real Indian, and modern religious native identities. It is my hope that exploring these touchstones will help the church to build relationships with indigenous communities characterized by reparative justice, cultural sensitivity, and mutual respect. So let's start by coming to terms first with who is in fact a Native American. In simplest terms, a Native American in our contemporary cultural context is an enrolled member of a recognized tribe. There are 574 federally recognized Indian tribes in the U.S., comprised of roughly 1.9 million enrollees. The 574 sovereign nations have varying requirements for who can enroll and how, but to my knowledge, all federally recognized tribes require that you are able to prove that you are a direct descendant of a previously enrolled member. Some tribes do have additional requirements. The absentee Shawnee tribe requires that new enrollees have a blood quantum of 1/4, meaning that at least one grandparent is considered full blood. The Cherokee Nation, to the contrary, is open to any person who is a descendant of a member listed on their rolls. They are active and engaged citizens of the Cherokee Nation who fall well below the 1 in 128th degree of Indian blood. Some Pacific Northwest tribes also require a level of cultural competence and communal partition beyond lineage to be considered an enrolled member, while other tribes, not to be named today, consider membership an automatic formality at birth, used primarily to expand government benefits, regardless of the enrollee's participation in community. In short, Native American tribes determine who is a member of the community themselves, as well they should. But what results is that what it means to be native on a Traditionary reservation can look and feel very different than what it means to be a Shawnee living in an urban environment. So even though they may not be the best indicator of cultural competence and communal connection, federal recognition and tribal enrollment are of extreme importance for tribal communities. For federal recognition and tribal enrollment, numbers are used to determine government benefits, land and resource rights, legal status, and protection under the law. For example, federal recognition keeps dubious upstart tribes from vying for valuable government resources and protections rightly accorded to historically recognized tribal communities, often stemming from long-standing treaties. Also, enrollment standards ensure that what we call pretendians cannot appropriate Native cultural identities and practices for financial, social, academic, or personal gain. Finally, allowing tribal communities to recognize for themselves who are members honors tribal agency and sovereignty and self-determination. So while blood quantum was created as a form of systematic erasure and a mechanism by which Native lands and resources could be seized, rooting Native identity in lineage and enrollment status as opposed to culture and kinship, had the unintended benefit of clearly delineating legally, if not culturally and socially, who is and who is not a Native American. Now, are there members of Native communities that have been adopted culturally into communities, but who may not be enrolled members? Absolutely. Are there historic tribal communities that exist outside of federal recognition for historically verifiable reasons, like some of the American-Canadian tribes? Of course. But even in these instances, it is the tribal communities themselves who determine who is and who is not Native American. Now, at this point, a thoughtful person may well be thinking, great, we've got it. Recognized tribe, lineage, enrollment. But what does it mean to be a Native American in this day and age? It's not only a good question, it's the right question, given that Native communities and Indigenous kinship circles are not lost to history. They are contemporary peoples with contemporary problems that exist in a very real way within and without the contemporary Christian church. Today, an estimated 66% of Native Americans identify as Christian. While the largest church is Roman Catholic, the majority of those Native Christians identify as being on the evangelical spectrum. Anecdotally, when my Aunt Bev was in her final days at Veneta Hospital, a well-meaning, well-trained chaplain came by and very politely asked if we needed a medicine man to come and aid in her passing. And Aunt Bev, in her customarily exasperated tone, I get it from her, by the way, took off her oxygen mask just to say, my dear, I've been Southern Baptist for 65 years. But it's not just my Aunt Bev. When the Shawnee were forcibly relocated to northeast Oklahoma, the first thing they did at White Oak was establish their stomp grounds. The very second thing they did later that evening was to start building a church so that it would be ready on Sunday morning, having been Christianized by primarily the Moravians prior to forced removal. Today, at our Shawnee tribal meetings, prayers are offered, sometimes in Shawnee, sometimes in English, but all the time they end, in Jesus' name we pray. In short, colonization and Christianization happened. They are historical realities. And more importantly, they are the lived reality of many Indigenous persons, not only in the U.S., but around the globe. It cannot be undone. So what do we do now? The problem we often run into culturally is that we have preconceived notions of what indigeneity is in a North American context. And we see this taking shape in the search for the real Indian in interesting and very problematic ways. Not the least of which is this pervasive tokenship that parades as a progressive concern for a particular kind of representation. We would never ask an Asian panelist to wear something Asian, or a black panelist to say something black. That would be understandably offensive. But it's culturally acceptable, even in politically correct circles, to say, "You don't look Indian," as if wearing what we call feathers, leathers, and beads are indicators of native cultural competence and communal belonging. In truth, not every Native American is a person of color. And a lot of Native Americans are people of color that we may not readily identify. The assistant chief of the Shawnee tribe presents as a black man, having both African and indigenous history. In reality, there are thousands upon thousands of Native Americans who look a lot more like me than the image of indigeneity that Hollywood has placed within our collective imagination. While phenotypes and genotypes can be indicators of indigeneity, colors fade so quickly. My great-grandfather did not speak English. My grandfather was full-blood Shawnee and Delaware. And a few generations later, here I am, curly-headed and white as can be. Even more importantly, stereotypical phenotypes are not indicators of what really matters to tribal communities, namely cultural competence, belonging and kinship, and most importantly, communal contribution, which takes shape in a variety of ways. Additionally, this Western obsession with looking and acting Indian forces Native peoples into performative spaces and modes of being that are demeaning, reductive, intrinsically essentializing, and implicitly racist. This tokenship robs indigenous communities of the cultural sovereignty of choosing their own markers for identity and belonging, furthering the systematic erasure that reservations, government roles, and blood quantum have not yet accomplished. We also place an impossible standard on indigeneity when we use performative cultural qualifiers as our measuring stick for who is Indian, especially given that most cultural ceremonies were outlawed until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. While there has been a great revival of Indian cultural practices since 1978, today, many, if not most, Indian ceremonies and rites of passage are practiced on sacred lands in extremely rural environments. In many tribes, including for the Shawnee, these rites cannot be recorded, shared, or even described outside of these times and places. As a result, individuals who live out of state or in urban environments may be effectively cut off from these ceremonies and rites of passage for most, if not all, of their lives. Are urban Indians whose native lives often find expression in intertribal and intercultural events in larger cities not also native? Do we have room in our heads for their diasporic indigeneity as well? Now, in the church, with our mythical obsession with the real Indian, it's led us to what I call the red and yellow, black and white style of forming UN-style indigenous or Christian communities, where token representation serves as a vapid substitute for the real work of forming diverse, inclusive churches. As Two-Spirit Elder John Hawk-Koch recently shared with me in an oral history interview, I stopped going to church because I always felt like it was Indians on parade. I was always having to dress up and play at something. It just got to be so exhausting. This fixation on a stereotypical, performative, historic orientation is often coupled with an obsession on lamenting the historical tragedies of colonization and Christianization, in which Native peoples are asked to endure and accept apologies on behalf of all of Native America, often in highly performative venues and on highly publicized occasions. This obsession with token representation and intensive focus on historical atrocities of colonization and Christianization are also perfect examples of what I call convenient Caucasian catharsis. Convenient Caucasian catharsis. It's convenient to obsess about finding and tokenizing the real Indian because it allows us to ignore the indigenous persons and families who are within and peripheral to our own communities. It's convenient to emote with bleeding hearts on the historical atrocities of colonization because it means we can turn a blind eye to the contemporary effects of colonization, namely legal battles for tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction, land and water rights, and the economic, social, and health crises that plague contemporary indigenous communities. It's convenient to lament about how Christianization has led to the demonization and oppression of Native cultures and languages, because it distracts us from the conversation we should be having about how our ecclesial structures, our worship services, our use of language, and our theo-spiritual worldviews are inaccessible to, even hostile to, oppressed persons and marginalized communities. I would challenge us to consider how our work and our ministry with Native persons may be informed and inspired by a need for convenient Caucasian catharsis in ways that center the helper, the church, and in ways that may be of no real help or benefit to Native persons and communities. So how can we as Christians and as churches really support tribal communities and foster healthy, reparative, justice-oriented relationships? First, I think we need to acknowledge that we live and serve in a church that was built on Indian land. Now, I'm not advocating that we simply add token land acknowledgments to our announcements at worship and call it good, though that can be a good first step. I am asking that my non-Native brothers, sisters, and kin be cognizant, be vigilant as to how and to why and from where we seek to minister to and with Indigenous persons and communities. Land acknowledgments are great, but I think we do better to start by acknowledging that Native Christians are often forced to live in that tension that exists between white guilt and white supremacy. Now, I'm going to say that again because at least one of you was thinking about lunch. Native Christians live and move and have their being in that theo-spiritual and communal space between white guilt and white supremacy. Where do our concerns and motivations lie on that spectrum? Are we supremacist in our orientation, concerned ultimately for the salvation of brown souls by an increasingly white American Jesus? Now that sounds preposterous when we say it out loud, but I would venture to guess that if we reflected critically on the way our congregations and communions and movements have historically related to minority groups, we will quickly discover that this critique hits dangerously and consistently close to home. Or are we operating from a place of white guilt, of desperately trying to distance ourselves from the sins of our fathers through frantic virtue signaling, cloying empathy, and empty, meaningless gestures that really only serve to help us feel better? So I would like to propose that we start with us, with our assumptions, our prejudices, our unstated, perhaps unconscious needs and motivations. Where are we individually and collectively on that spectrum between white guilt and white supremacy? For only when we come to terms with our place on that spectrum can we move forward as true allies for Native persons and communities. Well, then what? First, Focus on the tangible. Focus on the real-world problems of contemporary Native communities. Yes, colonization happened. Yes, it was demonic and awash with sins for which we must atone. But many Native communities survived. So focus on helping them thrive. Focus on advocating for educational endeavors that empower tribal citizens to better themselves and their community. Focus on financially supporting food security projects and nutrition programs and other health-related initiatives that address hunger and the many health crises that cripple Native families and communities. Make your support for the ongoing fight for tribal sovereignty, jurisdiction, and land and resource rights known to your local, state, and national legislators, and for the love of God, vote accordingly. Celebrate Native cultural events and frequent tribal cultural institutions in ways that are respectful, non-appropriating, and that honor the diversity and complexity of Native cultures, traditions, languages, and lifeways. In short, stop lamenting and virtue signaling and tokenizing and do something. Do anything that actually empowers Native persons and communities. Next, let's focus on what our local communities and congregations can do to foster healthy relationships with Native families and communities. We can start by laying aside our Savior complex. Jesus doesn't need us to save the Indians. Are you listening, church? Jesus does not need us to save the Indians. Most of them already identify as Christian, and even the most traditional elders would remind us that they had a covenant with the Creator long before a white missionary ever set foot. Many Native Christians practice their faith in their homes and among their kin and in beloved community, in sacred times and in holy places that simply do not coincide with our particular addresses and our regularly scheduled Sunday morning worship time. It's not that they're not choosing us. It's that the idea of picking a church and showing up on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. is not an idea that translates well into most tribal communities. And it's time for that to be okay. I know that we have denominational leaders here, so I want to speak briefly on a broader level, thinking in particular about our conferences and international movements. What can we do regionally and nationally to foster reparative justice-oriented relationships with Native communities and Indigenous kinship circles? Again, apologies and statements are important, but they can only be a first step. In our attempts to draw this circle wider, we should be intentional about fostering a sacred space within our movements for the development of non-geographical regions, conferences, dioceses, whatever your particular verbiage, that exist parallel to our geographically oriented ecclesial structures. One example of this is the United Methodist Indian Missionary Conference, of which many of you are aware. Another lesser-known example of this approach is the First Peoples congregation of your distant restorationist cousins, the Community of Christ, formerly known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This non-geographical congregation serves First Nation peoples across the U.S. and Canada, providing a means by which congregants can participate in the life and witness of the church in ways that run parallel to Community of Christ's hierarchical denominational structure. This non-geographical congregation dates back to the 1830s, providing the sacred space, time, and community needed for uniquely indigenous expressions of the RLDS faith to emerge in relative freedom and in organic relationship with the communion of the Community of Christ movement worldwide. In the First Peoples congregation, Native Christians are empowered to gather at times and to worship in ways that truly integrate their Christian faith with their indigenous values and indigenous identities. I was so excited to learn about the work of the Disciples Center for Indigenous Ministry that is emerging from the Yakima mission. support this important endeavor. As this important community and movement continues to grow and to bear good fruit, I would encourage leaders on every level to look to other communities of faith to explore ways these ministries can exist within or parallel to contemporary disciple structures and communities. There is no need to reinvent the medicine wheel. Perhaps a non-geographical First Nations region or a North American and Indigenous peoples congregation would be helpful in giving Native peoples a sacred time, place, and community through which to explore Indigenous identity, traditions, and cultures within a disciples of Christ context. And this is important. Please don't manufacture it from above and then be shocked when it's not taking root and growing. Ask your Native families and communities what they want and need from your regions and from the national church. Give them the support they've asked for, and then get out of the way. Agency and independence are key in Indigenous ministries. Remember, sovereignty within an Indigenous Christian context often looks a lot like trust. I'm afraid I've gone over a little bit of my time, so I do want to end there, but thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today on the complexities of religious identity and belonging within a contemporary North American Christian context. I hope that what I've said will be helpful for you as you continue your work toward justice and reconciliation in your ministries and in your organizations and in your institutions, as you strive to become that movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. Thank you.
Proud professor moment here. There we go. The title of my paper comes from my training in the field of U.S. history that specializes in the history of the American West, as well as important works that contribute to the historiography of the field. Now, historiography is not a word one normally finds in casual reading, but it is a concept that should be familiar to students of history. Historiography deals with the writing of history. Historiography is the study of the various approaches to historical method, the actual writing of history, and primarily the various interpretations of historical events. Historiography is the study of the techniques employed by the individual historian, and in the broadest sense, it is the study of the history of history, as described by historians. Any historical occurrence may be interpreted in a variety of ways because historians themselves are a factor in the equation. Each one has different interests, priorities, and points of view, and the passage of time can lead to dramatic changes in interpretation. The eminent American historian John Hope Franklin said, "The writing of history reflects the interest, predilections, and even prejudices of a given generation." Historical interpretation is always constructed through discourses. Discourses of discovery, redemption, conquest, civilization, patriarchy, whiteness, to name just a few. And the key is to recognize, understand, or at least acknowledge our ideological position that is determined by both individual attributes as well as structural factors. Just as theological education challenges us to recognize our embedded theologies and our interpretive biblical hermeneutical lens, we must also pay close attention to our embedded views of history. Embedded history is still the interpretation of historical facts that has been recorded or written and preserved as history, And that influences how we in the Stone Campbell movement tell our history, mostly from a perspective of exceptionalism. A lot of the history we continue to promote is actually the historiographical record of specific historians whose cultural, social, and educational biases influence the narrative. And one such embedded history that has remained virtually unchallenged is our slogan, "We are an American religion born on the frontier." And I flipped through and found just on some random church websites some of descriptions. I made sure I took out identifying factors. We are born and bred on the American frontier. We originated on the American frontier. We are the most American on the 19th century frontier. We were pushing boundaries into the new frontiers as a frontier people, redefining ourselves and the church. And we came into existence on that new American frontier, that rugged and rough existence of those hardy souls. And notice that last part. And as we moved into the frontier and we settled into one place, cleared the land, and established our homes and then our churches and then our schools. No doubt this historical narrative was influenced by the 1931 history written by W.E. Garrison titled "Religion Follows the Frontier, A History of the Disciples of Christ," where he stated, "Born on the frontier, disciples of Christ had only those frontier materials out of which to develop the instruments of advancement." He described the origins and the progress of the disciples as social evolution that he felt constituted genuine American history, the pioneer on the margins of the frontier that lived that perilous existence, requiring both physical and moral courage, as well as common sense methods that yielded both individual and utilitarian results. And this wilderness philosophy adapted institutions as well to meet its needs. And you can see some of the quotes from his book. There we go. Whoops, let me go back. You know, we were born under pioneer conditions. We are distinctively American. That's throughout that 1931 history. But by 1931, when Garrison wrote his history of the disciples, there was another influence working on his interpretation of history. And it goes back to that famous 1893 essay, "The Significance of the Frontier in American History," written by historian Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner's settlement of the West had served as a paradigm for the writing of American history as a whole, and his frontier thesis had identified a process that seemed to explain American development and American democracy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Turner believed that what made the United States different from Europe was the frontier experience. As European peoples and institutions arrived on the East Coast, the move westward meant that they had to civilize the frontier, and in doing so, they lost some of their European identity and became something distinctive. They constructed a new American identity. For Turner, the frontier represented a coherent conceptual category that could be isolated and studied as a factor in American history. And he believed that the study of the frontier would reveal that really American part of our history. A presumption of exceptionalism from frontier ideology allowed for manifest destiny to take place as a process of westward expansion that also included religion going into the American West, acting as a civilizing agent for the federal enterprise of securing land and promoting a racialized mission to create a national identity that values whiteness. As historian Patricia Limerick suggests, the term frontier blurs the fact of conquest and throws a veil over the similarities between the story of American westward expansion and the planetary story of the expansion of European empires. Whatever meanings historians give the term, in popular culture, it carries a persistently happy affect, a tone of adventure, heroism, and even fun, very much in contrast with the tough, complicated, and sometimes bloody and brutal realities of conquest. As Turner continued to develop the ideas from his paper presented in 1893, his frontier thesis not only became popular, but it also became the most American of all of the explanations of the nation's distinctiveness. But problematic aspects of Turner's concept of the frontier went unquestioned for decades within the fields of U.S. history and Western history, and I dare say still do today in some of the writings of American religious history. Historian Daisy Machado wrote, "Turner understood the frontier to be a place of virgin land that was there for the taking. Land and democracy became inseparable elements in the self-conscious creation of this nation's identity." And you can see it from his quote there, or from some of his quotes. There we go. Free lands, Western democracy and individual liberty and equality, and then that last one, opportunity, where natural resources are open to all for the taking and extraction of the land. Now, the problem with this national land myth is that the lands of the American West were never really free, nor were they virgin, nor unoccupied, as native peoples already inhabited what became known as the North American continent. One can also view Turner's notion of frontier as a cultural construct that has meaning largely in ethnocentric terms. Up until Turner's thesis, the dictionary meaning of frontier, though European as it was, referred to a border zone that separated one nation from another. Turner, though, wrote of the American frontier less as a fixed boundary than as a moving line of military and cultural advance and retreat, and he called it the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. And implicit in this language was the idea not only of cultural contact, but also of conquest, of white American civilization sweeping over Native American savagery and perhaps eventually washing it away. From that 1872 painting of American Progress, notice the light and the darkness and the figures as Manifest Destiny moves from east to west. So when Frederick Jackson Turner presented his frontier thesis at the meeting of the American Historical Association in July 1893 in Chicago, he had been researching the topic for two earlier essays that he wrote, The Significance of History and the Problems in American History in 1892 there. And in that second paper, he began to explore the continuous rebirth of civilization that takes place on the frontier. So logically, the progression now of significance of the American frontier in 1893, he is no doubt aware of the shift in language and the meaning as the word frontier began to appear more in the popular vernacular, and for the first time in 1890, Webster's International Dictionary of the English Language officially added the phrase, the border of the settled or civilized parts of the country, to now qualify the type of border represented by the word. And remember that civilization was also a part of the federal official Indian policy to assimilate native peoples into an Anglo culture and identity, and in the process then dispossessing them of the land that could be used for white settlement and the extraction of resources. But also important in Turner's interpretation of frontier history was the context for the delivery of this 1893 paper. The World's Columbian Exposition, aka the Chicago World's Fair, held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the new to him world in 1492. Now, the dedication ceremonies of the fair were held in October of 1892, but the fairgrounds weren't actually opened until the public until 1893. And the fair was to be conceptualized as a veritable encyclopedia of civilization. Held in Jackson Park, the centerpiece to showcase this civilization was the Court of Honor, where the buildings were designed in the neoclassical architectural style, lathered with plaster of Paris and painted a chalky white, thus bestowing the moniker of the White City on the main exposition buildings. There's a double entendre because the whiteness of the White City became increasingly offensive to some. In response to the determination of African Americans to show the world their accomplishments since emancipation, exposition directors insisted that African American proposals for exhibits be approved by all-white state committees, and most of those requests were rejected outright. Although exposition managers set aside a special day for African Americans, the fair, through its racist policies, had already helped pave the way for the national acceptance of the separate but equal doctrine that would become the law of the land in 1896. And of course, Ida Wells and Frederick Douglass, Ida Wells crafted this pamphlet that was distributed. But interesting, on the midway part of the fair, you could pay a price to go visit different villages, a Cairo street, an Algerian, Tunisian village, a Dahomey village. You could pay money to go see people in these villages, a live human zoo. And notice, interesting, the Chinese village, the Chinese Exclusion Act was already in place in 1882, so you can come and we'll pay to go look at you, but don't live here. This panoptical gaze through the Chicago World's Fair is interesting. Yet, Native Americans, their exhibit put together by anthropologists consisted of wax figures, a vanished people, a relic of the past. And we can't forget that this fair is where we got that Anglo-American identity that's reinforced with the Pledge of Allegiance, written by Francis Bellamy, first published in September of 1892 in a popular children's magazine. Again, part of this 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, and it gets promoted. And the pledge was first used in public schools on October 12, 1892, during Columbus Day observances organized to coincide with the opening of the World's Columbian Exposition. In the old Bellamy salute, of course, that gets changed later in history, problematic as well. It is the Chicago World's Fair around Turner's Frontier thesis, in which Antonin Dvorak is commissioned to write a symphony to debut at the fair. The financial impact caused the New York Philharmonic to have him complete the work, but it did debut in December of 1893 at Carnegie Hall and became known as the New World Symphony. If you go back and listen to the third movement, you do hear the nature and the native drums, but when you hear the fourth movement, if we can hear a little bit of that. The March of the Empire West. It was natural in this context for Turner's advancement of the frontier thesis, where the process of settling the frontier served as the basis of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States was unique among world nations. Turner not only formulated a thesis for understanding the formation of a nation, but he was also then able to train generations of historians who continued forth his ideas through the universities of the United States. And his frontier thesis remained the standard historiographical paradigm for interpreting Western history, until a new group of scholars following the new social history methodological approach that had appeared in the 1960s and 70s began to question some of the assumptions inherent in Turner's thesis. The new Western history movement emerged in the 1980s and attempted to recast the writing of American frontier history in the categories of race, class, gender, and environment. Oh, there we go. And it was the 1987 publication of Patty Limerick's book, The Legacy of Conquest, which offered the most direct challenge to Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. Limerick and later other new Western historians challenged Turner's view of the process of settling the frontier by declaring that the West was always a place with many different actors and events, not an empty land anxiously awaiting the arrival of white settlers. Limerick characterizes this period of Western history as conquest. And by viewing the West as a place, she repositions the role of white settlers. These enterprising individuals did not discover a new place. They attempted to conquer a land already inhabited by indigenous peoples. And when other actors appeared there, they were viewed as imposing now on the white Western settlers. Since its emergence in the field of U.S. history, the new Western history has retold the story of the American West from the point of view of the oppressed, colonized, and conquered. Scholars have challenged the Turnerian myth of the frontier and have forced scholars to re-examine their understandings of the region. But unfortunately, the movement also emerged within the context of the history and culture wars of the late 20th century and its backlash against political correctness. And according to historian Natalie Massip, just as the culture wars of the period hinged on a definition of an American identity, the reappraisal of the Western past was perceived by some as questioning what it meant to be a Westerner and ultimately an American. Where Turner saw the 19th century West as free land awaiting the expansion of Anglo-American settlement and American democracy, the new scholars rejected the concept of a frontier altogether and go to considerable lengths to avoid using the word, or because Patty Limerick designated it the F word. It's been reclaimed by Western historians, although Patty still refuses and uses the F word there. So in view of the new Western historians, white English-speaking Americans did not so much settle the West as conquer it. And the conquest, though, was never complete. Anglo-Americans in the West continued to share the region not only with the Indians who preceded them there, but also with the African Americans, Asians, Latin Americans, and others who flowed into the West at the same time that they did. Western history, the new scholars maintain, is a process of cultural convergence, a constant competition and interaction, economic, political, cultural, and linguistic, amongst diverse peoples. The Turnerian West was a place of heroism and triumph, and above all, progress, a place where Anglo-Americans spread democracy and civilization into untamed lands. To Turner and his disciples, the 19th century West was a place where rugged individualism flourished and replenished American democracy. But to the new scholars, Western individualism is a self-serving myth. They argued that the region was always inextricably tied to a national and internationalist capitalist economy. Indeed, the only thing that sustained Anglo-American settlement of the West was the demand in other places for its natural resources. Western pioneers were never self-sufficient. They depended on government-subsidized railroads for access to markets, federal troops for protection from Indians, and later government-funded dams and canals for irrigating their fields and sustaining their towns. And while Turner defined the West as a process of settlement that came to the closing of the frontier in 1890, Western historian says the history does not end there. It continues, sadly, into our own time. And this frontier history impacts the history of the disciples as our denomination intersects with the history of the American West. And so particularly a case study in frontier rhetoric, because disciples in Oklahoma show how this historiography of Turner's frontier thesis influences our own history. So for Oklahoma, prior to even the 1830 Indian Removal Act, you had, look at the vast empires of the Osage, and even part of Oklahoma is considered part of the Comanche Empire there. The 1836 Act, removal, you notice the Osages have gone up to Kansas, and then the Cherokees and others start settling. After removal is complete, this 1860 Act, now we've divided up lands from the five, particularly the five southeast tribes that have been relocated in diasporic conditions. But removals continue after 1830. All of these peoples displaced from different geographic parts of the nation come into what was land promised to those five tribes to be theirs in perpetuity, and now we have divided it up even more. So in 1866, the western half of Indian Territory was ceded to the United States, which opened then to white settlers in 1889, and that became the territory of Oklahoma in 1890, eventually encompassed all of those lands ceded. And the two territories were united and admitted to the Union as the state of Oklahoma in 1907. Now, another embedded history around the settler colonialism that took place in Oklahoma focuses on the myth that there was the land run that opened up the Oklahoma Territory for settlement, because it was not a singular event. There were actually 5 land runs beginning in 1889, and 2 public land auctions that further dispossessed native peoples from their lands. By the early 20th century, Indian Territory had even been abolished, and the remaining lots of land had been reassigned from tribal entities to individual Indians, which made scattered Indian holdings impossible for Oklahoma then to gain statehood. So quickly, you can see some of the colors of the land grabs in 1889, 1891. The largest one geographically is going to be the 4th one there in 1893, where the Cherokee Outlet is going to be opened up. But then even some smaller ones after that, the land lottery. And then by the time 1907 we get to statehood, all of Oklahoma really is available. The disciples' presence in Oklahoma also mimic many aspects of Turner's frontier thesis. The creation of the Disciples Church Extension in 1883 to help disciples' congregations and mission stations secure land and construct new buildings represent a settler system in which disciple churches operated. The most celebrated story of the new church movement during the early history of the church extension work, of course, was the ride of E.F. Boggess into Oklahoma Territory in 1893 to stake sites of land on behalf of church extension. But as I have learned, there were actually earlier church ministers that made early runs into the openings, that latter part of that quote there. The first one in 1889, J.M. Monroe was an evangelist working for the American Christian Missionary Society, headed for the territorial capital in Guthrie, to organize First Christian Church in 1889, celebrated really as the first disciples congregation in Oklahoma. And the Disciples Church in Norman had already been built prior to the Boggess run in 1893. But it is Boggess's famed and then after the fact, in the land auction, there had been other lands secured down in the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache country in southwestern Oklahoma, thanks to Mr. Morgan. But church extension was hard at work providing loans to build churches, as they said, to occupy this new country. And it is that, and you can see the list there of the different churches. But it's E.F. Boggess in 1893 that's the frontier myth that dominates the story of disciples in Oklahoma. And church extension made it possible for him to purchase a horse to make the land run, to spend time training it to, quote, start to run at the crack of a gun, and station himself astride the horse at the most favorable point so he could run in the quickest possible time to parry. And they even provided funds to cover his pulpit for a month or so while he prepared for this run. And so on September 16th, 1893, Boggess was one of the many settlers lining up at the borders around what he called the Promised Land. And his work on behalf of church extension and individuals and congregations has, of course, been celebrated in the disciples' narrative of that rugged individual working to settle the frontier on behalf of the church and bring civilization to a land that needed to be Americanized. What we think about with the land run in Oklahoma, we also forget a lot of those land run people rode the train. If you had the money, you could purchase a ticket, ride the train in, and get off and then go stake your land. So even in Boggess's recollection of his participation in that Cherokee Strip land run, there is an undercurrent of racist themes of manifest destiny that emerge as he himself says, "The harvest is white, and we pray for the workers." And as Daisy Machado reminds us, that is why frontier became an archetypal word in the 19th century U.S. It spoke to the universal reality for a people believed to be chosen by God to complete a manifest destiny in a new land. And the frontier promised newness of life as that life was given shape by the forces found in the land itself. And the issue of race, like other ideas found in America, was tied to the land and to who could control the land and its borders. And settler colonialism is still alive and well today. Every year in Oklahoma, children celebrate those land grabs, bringing their wagons to school and participating in that. I'm going to set you up, Dave, here. In the 1950s, I started finding a lot of articles of salmon suppers that Christian churches were going to be doing as a way for Yakima Christian Mission to make money. But the cultural appropriation that takes place with some of that was still alive and well even in the 1950s. Now, I'm not saying that we have to give up describing ourselves as a religion born on the American frontier, but we must understand that particular historical narrative is fraught with racialized undercurrents of white privilege and supremacy around systems of land ownership and use regarding the extraction of resources. And the history of the word also frames a racialized identity around American exceptionalism that sadly we see lived out today with harmful consequences, particularly around issues of Christian nationalism. And our churches today are beneficiaries of a settler colonial system that utilized settler Christianity to dispossess indigenous peoples of land and culture. And all of our churches occupy land that once belonged to indigenous peoples. At the very least, we disciples need to be attentive to issues of justice for Native American peoples and to work on their behalf. Thank you.
Well, it never feels good following two folks like that. I want to say that it's an honor to be here this morning, to be with you, especially in this year of the 100th anniversary of Disciples developing their own boarding school. To have this event now is to say something about who we might become. And I think it matters, at least for me, to be here. I would also like to honor the landscape that we're in, to be able to get off a plane to be on this soil, to come to this place, to feel the wind that is here, to hear the ancestors' thunder last night. It is a piece that is a gift to be a part of this. And recognizing, and I appreciate the land acknowledgement so much, and because of that, I also recognize that the moment that we do that we invest ourselves in the people of this land. And so before I speak, I would like to ask if it's okay for my Indigenous kin to be able to speak. Thank you. I would say that I'm going to use a few terms here this morning, and just so that you know, Native, Indian, Indigenous, Aboriginal, those terms I use interchangeably. The term when I use American or America, I usually am referring to the landscape of the Americas and the people of the Americas. U.S. and United States is directly to the systemic country that runs this landscape today. With that said, I take a look at this and start thinking about it and recognize from the viewpoint of indigeneity that indigeneity would ask us first to question what does the church look like as this frontier movement begins. And so we have a quote from Alexander Campbell that comes out in 1852. In 1852, he addresses the Canonsburg College in Pennsylvania. And when he talks to those young men there, he says, in our country's destiny is involved the destiny of Protestantism, and in its destiny, the destiny of all the nations of the world. God has given in awful charge to Protestant England and Protestant America, the Anglo-Saxon race, the fortunes not of Christendom only, but of all the world. David Harrell, in his book, Quest for America, uses this as a synopsis of the whole address, being clear that perhaps this tells us what disciples are thinking in that day and time. And so when we look at that and we consider that quote, you can't miss the primary piece. This is about Protestantism. And as he writes that address and talks about it, it is that piece that again and again it's going against the papacy. It's Catholicism. It is that piece that should have been left behind long ago. It is Luther and what comes out of Luther and this Protestant movement. This is everything. This is the Christianity we are supposed to be having. But of course, whose Christianity? And then we look another piece I quote, England and America, the place of birth and the place of adoption. These two countries who are Protestant, these are the countries, these are the nations who are chosen by God. But of course, if those are the nations chosen by God, who are the people who are chosen? And of course, he makes it very clear that white Anglo-Saxon is the one who controls and governs. So we might just accept, if we should choose to accept, that these three pieces are who disciples are in 1852 as they move westward. We see them as the Christians, nationalists, and white supremacists. But indigeneity would ask us, if this is a nationalist movement, Christian movement, what is a piece of nationalism that they may get on board with? Well, 8 years later, Civil War. 9 years later, Grant becomes president. Grant becomes president, and this administration comes into place, and they look around and they go, we just got done with a war that was going to be about not giving any chance of having two nations on this continent. And then they look around and go, in their terms, there's over 350 treaties. Every one of those treaties with indigenous peoples create a legal sovereign nation. How in the world do we do something about that? We were worried about two nations. Now we got over 350. What are we going to do? They get right to work and they get the Board of Indian Commissioners. They form that, put that in place, and a few months later they come back with the whole idea of eliminating those 350 nations. So we need to understand that what they come back with is a war policy. But being who they are, they called it the Grant Peace Policy. And they say there's three primary pieces that we need to take care of here. There's plenty more, but there's at least three. The first thing we got to do is we have to end treaty making, and we have to figure out a legal way to get rid of the other treaties. We need to find a way to make all of those indigenous people citizens. Because if they're citizens of the United States, they can't be citizens of another nation. And the last piece that we must do, which Albert Memmi would have us remind us, is we must get them to believe it. And so sure enough, at the State of Address Union, Grant comes out and says, this is what we're going to do, folks. We're going to have Christian denominations across the country start boarding schools. And in those boarding schools, we're going to bring the children in, and we're going to civilize them and Christianize them. And of course, he doesn't verbally say this, but by the time they become adults, and we do this for a few generations, we'll be there. Well, disciples don't get in on this gig. It's 1870. The structure isn't quite there yet. The power base isn't there, but by the turn of the century, well, now that's a different matter altogether. And so as we move into the turn of the century, we look to what is now Washington State, and we've got over 50 years of developing congregations in Washington. Power base is coming together, and in the middle of that, in central Washington, is the Yakima Christian Mission. And W.F. Turner comes there in 1912 as the pastor. And as pastor, he listens to neighbors and the folks in the church, and he starts getting stories about the reservation that's just down the road. And so he develops an idea of who these folks are, but his ideas are pretty skewed even for the day and time. For when he writes later, he talks about the Yakimas down there, those pagan people, those folks who engage in orgies, those folks who go out and will allow their children to die rather than to bring in physicians. And so, with this viewpoint in his mind, 6 years later, he leaves the pastorate and becomes the general secretary for the American Christian Missionary Society of Washington. And with that, he begins developing a boarding school. The first thing he must do to do that, of course, is to get a disciple power base in place. So he gets F.W. Burnham, president of the American Christian Missionary Society, on board to be a part of this. Then he gets 3 other Northwest disciple leaders on board. Once he has that in place, then he turns and goes, well, to really pull this off, to do it on the Yakima Reservation today in 1918, and when he starts starting this, is we have to have approval of the local people. And so he goes, because he has no relationship with anybody on the reservation in that way, he goes to Lucas Virgil McWhorter. McWhorter is a rancher, white rancher, and farmer of the area. He has a deep relationship with the Yakimas. He hunts with them, he fishes with them, he goes up in the mountains and spends months with them hanging out. He also does this. He goes and fights the federal government, the state government, and businesses from encroaching upon the land. He is held in high respect by the Yakima. So when Turner shows up and asks him to be on the board, McWhorter knows exactly what's being asked here. And so he goes, yes, I'll be a part of your board, but I have one stipulation. On the local board of this boarding school by ACMS, there must be at least 3 Yakima on the board. The idea of this is that this would create a boarding school that would be unlike any other. And Turner agrees to it. And so he's got that piece in place. The next piece is he's got to finance it. And so just about the same time that he becomes a part of the American Missionary Society, he meets Red Fox and Black Hawk. Now, Red Fox is known for moving across the country, creating kind of like a Masonic order, the teepee order. And so he moved from town to town, starting an order, raising money, and then moving to the next town, doing it again and again and again. The work out there is going, well, calling him a con man may be a little stretch, but there's something going on here. The bottom line is Turner buys into him, introduces him to Burnham of ACMS, and from that point on, Black Hawk, who presents himself as Blackfeet, him and Hawk goes from church to church, wearing the regalia, presenting themselves as Indians as the way that the white church would like, raising money. By 1920, they end up in Cincinnati when ACMS gets together at their convention, and at that time, ACMS awards Turner a certain amount of money to begin a boarding school. And so, in 1921, the American Christian Teepee Mission opens on the reservation, on the Yakima Reservation. When it opens, of course, it goes on, and the writings, the records are pretty sparse. But what is going on there? We know that the mission was modeled off the John Roberts Wind River Reservation boarding school there. So, in the morning, kids got up to the bell. They went and they did the morning chores according to the bell. They ate breakfast according to the bell. They went to school according to the bell. They came home, they did the chores according to the bell. The bell rang for dinner. The bell rang for evening prayers, and the bell rang to go to bed. The life was structured and put into a box. They learned reading, writing, and arithmetic at school. They learned how to plow a straight row, how to plant wheat, how to raise hogs and cattle, how to sew dresses, how to become a seamstress, how to become a homemaker. Everything was put into place during that time. But what we're often not told is the first director, Joe Montague, comes in and he looks at what's going on and decides one critical piece. We'll run this boarding school, and what we'll do is we'll run it, but these Indians, these Yakima, they're not quite as smart. And so what we'll do is we will placate the power base, but we're going to do whatever we need to do. Of course, the 3 Yakima on the board go, what is going on here? They start complaining. They get McWhorter on board. He starts complaining, complains to Turner, complains to Burnham, who's now the president of the United Christian Society, who's the successor to ACMS, and no response. And so the Yakima and McWhorter all leave the board. From that time forward, over the next 100 years, there is no Yakima presence in the power base of the American Christian Teepee Mission, which is today Yakima Christian Mission. It's laid a base on how this was going to be run from that moment forward, so that it just kept changing through time, through each era as it moves through. By the 50s, the mission continues to be in a financial straits as it was earlier. And so they take on the role of being a foster care facility. So understand what being a foster care facility means in that area, is that you certainly take that on, but what you do, you also become a part of that, of putting folks into foster care and advising where they get adopted. Well, let's understand, children don't get adopted into Native families. In fact, the whole construct is to get them adopted into white families so they will become non-Indigenous, so that they'll become white to do exactly what the Grant administration was hoping for. Throughout this whole time, these children are being labeled in one way or another again and again and again, so that they become ranchers and seamstresses and homemakers. They get a very specific legal identity that's built into who they are going to be. Legal identities that fit the United States. Identities that can be taxable and saleable. As opposed to what indigeneity might call us to is a natural identity. To be the one believe that one can intuit. Now, I think that we all get this at some extent because we all know the science to who we are, right? We are people who are 60% water, and the rest of us is minerals. We are literally dirt and water. We get this at a very natural level if we're allowed to do it. It's just that we all have problems with it, right? Because we all have legal identities, and we play those identities out so well. But even the creation, the Spider Woman from the Hopi creation story, she takes 4 different colors of clay, puts water to them, works them, loves it, and creates humans. Even Nuwa of the Chinese creation story takes yellow clay, puts water to it, molds it, folds it, and humanity comes. The ancient Genesis storyteller talks about taking dirt and molding it and creating humans that are just like trees. Our natural identity is one that is ancestral. Indigeneity calls to that of the ancestors, that literally the ancestors that were died, and the water of who they were became a part of our rivers and our streams. The minerals of who they were are a part of our potatoes and carrots. When we drink water, we drink the ancestors. When we eat the ancestors. When we breathe their air. Indigeneity calls us to think in a different way, for when we start thinking that way, then we are our descendants. For when we die, they will be eating us and they will be drinking us. That all of a sudden we start recognizing the ancestors of yesterday and the descendants of tomorrow are alive right now in this moment. But we really live out legal identities. Our indigenous siblings live out legal identities. And what does that mean? What does that work of the American Christian TP Mission really play out? In the 1990s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente do a study on adverse childhood effects. And when they do that, they come up with this in a very general way of saying that for each trauma event that a child experiences, they get 1 A score. The more A scores they have, the more likely they're going to have problems with heart disease, diabetes, asthma, colon cancer, and suicide. That trauma events affect people physically. But about the same time, there was also studies on epigenetics. And epigenetics came out and saying this, is going, look, these events can be inherited, but it's not the gene that gets affected. The genes say who they are, But epigenetics the epigenetic will wrap itself around a gene. And so what happens is if something happens to an individual that a certain gene must be read to give them health, it can't be read. But that can be passed on. So how does that play out when we look at the boarding school that we have? Well, consider this. A child's at the boarding school. In the first years of the boarding school, children went hungry a number of different times. Child goes hungry for a day, a week, a month, 1 A score. A child is told that, look, you need to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And if you do that, you get to go to heaven. On the other hand, your parents who are washat, well, they'll go to hell. 2 A scores. You will be a fine young man and become a stockman and run cattle. And that is so much better than your father, who's a hunter. And you will become a young housekeeper and housewife rather than being a gatherer like your mother. You'll be so much better. 3 A scores. When we look at that, that's bad enough. When you put epigenetics to it, is that a child is at the mission. They gain 3 A scores. They grow up, they become an adult, they fall in love, they have children. Those children carry those 3 A scores with them. Now they go back to the mission, and they grow up there. Now the A score is all of a sudden now 3, 4, or 5. The difference between an A score of 1 that has a high level of suicide to an A score of 6 is a 5,000 degree increase. It's huge. So to be conservative, then when we look at what goes on with folks, is that when we look at suicides itself, and so a conservative piece in suicide, indigenous suicide today, when we consider that being 2.5 times the national average, we start understanding that the word suicide obscures the institutional and social cause of the act. Indigenous suicide in the U.S. is nothing less than genocide. But we can also recognize this. And I just got back from a funeral of a friend. When somebody dies of diabetes on the reservation, at least they know they're Indian. There are hundreds of thousands of folks who have been through foster care and adoption off the reservation and reservations, who are dying of diabetes, who are dying of suicide, who don't even know they're Indigenous. And consider this, is that when we start talking about these type of identities and how we shape these legal identities as disciples, is that those folks who do intuit their own indigeneity, but they don't have the credentials. Therefore, they can't and will not ever claim, even consider the idea that they might be Indigenous. And then there's a whole nother group of folks who do. They've intuited, they know they are, but they have credentials of, as we've heard, of unrecognized federal tribes. Folks who have recognized it, who don't have the facial features, who don't have the right skin color. And should they say something, they can be looked at as other. This is why I think it's important to realize that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, take a look at this, and in a couple of places, at least in Article 33, said Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity. People left alone naturally will intuit who they are. The right to identify a life is the gift of the ancestors. We have labeled and legally identified folks very well as disciples. We get to choose whether we start reparative work or not. But without reparations, nobody is healthy. Reparations need to begin today. If they don't begin today, we're done. And that only gets us to a chance to do restorative work. Restorative work cannot start until reparations have begun and are well on their way. And until reparations and restorative work, until we have decades and decades of that type of work behind us, there is no such thing as reconciliation. Health and grace lay in disciples' ability to learn and recognize our buried institutional racism in our structures of theology, education, benevolence, finance, mission, land, and buildings. Honor, harmony, and shalom lay in disciples' ability to dismantle our institutions, regain the insight of indigeneity, and live justly with creation. To move well into a just future is to bring forth the best of yesterday's ancestral knowledge, the imagination of tomorrow's descendants, to live in equanimity with dirt and water, hawk and salmon, bitterroot and deer, and remember the well-being of the least identity is the well-being of all of our identities.
Wow. Wow. My God, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm trying to get us a little bit back on our schedule. We won't have much time for any questions or comments. I think maybe we'll discuss as we're eating, if that's, does that work for y'all? I would like to invite at this point President Gillette of Lexington Theological Seminary, one of our sponsors, partners in this, just to have like 1 minute of, wonderful comments about Lexington Theological Seminary, where I once was privileged to serve as dean and academic vice president. So, Dr. Gillette.
He said 1 minute. I'll do my best. No, but to be faithful to Rick's desire to move the conference to its time frame, I will say this. Who's timing me? I need a timer, and I'm okay with that. Okay, thank you. So when I'm at 50 seconds, somebody do like this. So the mission of Lexington Theological Seminary is to prepare faithful leaders for the church to accomplish God's mission in the world. And we see the way we do that is through partnerships. Partnerships primarily with entities of the local, regional, and general church. In our heart of hearts, we see congregations as the place where we intend for God's mission in the world to take root. And the way I look at it is we have strong congregations, we have strong communities, we have strong mission in the world. And so that is how, as we think about what we do at LTS, we move forward. So we have a competency-based academic program. all the way from our certificate programs, certificate in Hispanic ministries, certificate in African American ministries, and certificate in rural ministries, which we're working on right now. From MA programs all the way up to our DMin. Our goal is to make congregations stronger, because strong congregations equal strong communities. And I don't think any of us will deny that we need strong communities now. So where am I? Part of what we will hope to do is to level the playing field for our graduates. Our students leave LTS with virtually no student loan debt. We hope that when they leave us, that they have a holistic view of how congregations operate, and that is pastor as leader, but lay leaders as leaders too. Those of you who've been in congregations know that strong congregations require a pastor and laity working in concert to accomplish the mission of that church. In the last 5 years, we've received 3 $1 million Lilly grants, and that is to our goal. One is a Thriving in Ministry grant aimed at creating strong pastors. One is a Thriving Congregations initiative aimed at creating strong congregations. And the most recent one is a Pathways for Tomorrow's grant. And that grant is to build bridges between our certificate programs for rural pastors, Latinx pastors, and African American pastors, so that they can move from those certificate programs into a degree program should they wish to do so. And so for our graduates who are here today, thank you for greeting me so warmly. For our board members who are here today, thank you so much for your support. And for all of you in this room who hope the best for all of our theological institutions, thank you for your prayers. And I'm here all day, and I'm happy to take questions. How did I do?
This is such a wonderful partnership between all 4 of our disciple seminaries. We are just so thrilled, and we are so thrilled to have such excellent scholarship that has been evidenced so far this morning in our own theological, educational institutions, and I am so grateful. We will now break for lunch. We will continue our conversation about these rich, rich, rich papers that we just have heard. So the meal is laid out for us. Where? There. That way, that direction, down in the chapel, and let's go eat. Is that okay? Oh, offer a prayer. Okay, sure. Wait, let's pray. I'll pray. Gracious God, thank you for the powerful message that you have brought us in these presentations, these wonderful conversations this morning. We pray that you help us process this incredible truth so that we may move toward your world of justice and reparation, repair, and ultimately toward healing and reconciliation. Please bless this fruit of the earth to the nourishment of our bodies. We ask all of these things in your holy name. Amen. Let's eat.